Hi folks, I'm laid up a bit at the moment, unfortunately, because of problems with my eye. I've just had some laser treatment on it, so I thought I would record a little bit of my thoughts about the 5th edition of the game, and in particular changing it, because this is something that comes up very, very frequently on the various blogs and YouTube channels that I watch, and I just thought I have a slightly different take on the need to change the 5th edition of D&D and also how you best achieve that. So I thought I would share that with yourselves, see what you think. So let's just sort of set out the problem as it is often presented, and the problem is this. People say, in general, that they think that the 5th edition of D&D is too easy, and it is also not very similar to earlier editions of the game in that it doesn't really require much player skill as opposed to character skill, and it can be a bit mechanistic in play. So they want to change things up, and in order to do that, the solution that they tend to go with is kind of wholesale rule changes, and these quite often are focused on the player side of things around character creation. So they'll introduce sort of different mechanisms for generating your character, which reduce your character's stats, and they might also say you're not allowed to use feats, or you're not allowed to have multi-class characters, and in various different ways, we're going to strip this back towards the basic core of the game without all these extra things around your character, which in their opinion make those characters overpowered and the game less deadly, and in their opinion less interesting. And the two examples that I've seen recently of this are one is 5e hardcore mode from Runehammer, and also I've seen some material about how Professor Dungeon Master likes to set out things in his campaign, and those are perfectly valid approaches if that's what you want and your players are happy with that kind of quite large obvious amounts of adjustment to the 5th edition of the game. And there is an alternative to that, which is that you play a slightly derivative game like 5 Torches Deep, which again has some lineage heritage from 5th edition in there, but actually is a different game in its own right. But again, it is trying to make the experience more like an old school game where the chances of your character dying are higher, and also you can have more player skill influencing the outcome, and less about what's on your character sheet. Now, my argument is actually there is another way to get there that might be better for you and your players. So let me explain what it is and why I think it might be better. And so my basic idea here is that let's try to leave the common experience of the game as untouched as possible from the player's perspective, because I know a lot of players who really love all the options that they get in 5th edition to create a character, And if you start to strip all that away from them and say, no, you can't have this feat, you can't have that class, we're changing, X, Y, and Z, they may quite legitimately say to you, well, then it's no longer what I expect from the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And why would I want to play that? I have signed up and I expect to play the 5th edition of the game, not something so different. So is it possible to keep that kind of core experience on the player side relatively intact, whilst just tweaking and changing things up maybe on the dungeon master side, so that the game is a little bit deadlier, there's some more player skill involved, things are a little bit less mechanistic, and maybe it's more like the old school experience that a lot of people seem to want and desire? And I think the answer is yes, you can. You absolutely can do that, but it's a lot subtler and it's a lot less obvious what it is that you need to change in order to get to that sort of sweet spot where you've got characters that are recognizably ordinary 5th edition characters, but playing in a deadlier world where their player skill will come into its own. So I'm not saying that you necessarily should do away altogether with some tweaking on the player side, but I think you can be a little bit more subtle about it. So the first thing to say is, actually at very low levels of play, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, particularly at kind of first level and probably a little bit at second level, is quite a deadly game. The players don't have access yet to the full arsenal of abilities that we'll get at later levels, and for them, it's very easy to challenge them with monsters that are going to be on the deadlier side. And therefore my first thing would be to say to dungeon masters who worry about the ease of which 5th edition players can destroy the challenge, is stay with the low levels, focus on that earlier set of levels. Certainly in terms of expectations for your campaign, try to put a cap on things as things get above kind of 5th level. Maybe you can get as high as 10th level. I've certainly played well beyond that, but things get progressively harder once you get past 10th level, what we used to call named level. And in the old game, AD&D, obviously characters, once they got to named level, would start to retire from a lot of active play, and they would move on to the kind of domain stronghold game, and there would be other characters who would tend to go on adventures. So it's that kind of natural break there at 10th level. And if you stay in that early part of the game, particularly kind of 1st to 5th, and then maybe with limited play in the 5th to 10th, you should have less problems challenging your players. So that's the first thing, is sort of set player expectations. We're not going to go all the way to 20th level here. This game is going to run like this for these number of levels. So that's number one thing. I think the next thing that I would do is maybe just look carefully at, and this is where I would advocate a few minor little tweaks, which are all in the rule books, by the way. Everything I'm going to suggest is not necessarily counter to anything in the player's handbook or the DMG. It's just a case of pointing out to your players as part of session 0, these are the particular options that we're going to be using. And so the first of these really is to try to avoid characters that are rolled randomly. because that's where you end up with characters starting with scores of 20 in some of their statistics, and that's where things start to get out of hand, a bit unbalanced. So, you know, up there in lights in the early part of the player's handbook are the options to have a fixed array or point buy. Both of those are perfectly valid options, and many players prefer them because they feel they're fairer, that, you know, everybody has the same opportunity to bring a character to the table that is about equal in power. And so certainly if you say we're not going to be rolling, then that is going to help. So having generated your stat scores, would I be advocating any sort of limits on classes or feats or things like this? Well, I might suggest two things, and again, this is not out of line with how the game is kind of officially played, but I think would help a little bit. But, you know, there may be other things you can do instead. So, you know, this, in terms of my approach, these things are not at the core, but they may help. And they are to just agree with your players which books you'll be using, again, as part of your session 0, from the official sort of D&D sources within the campaign. So you'll find the Adventurers League already kind of puts a limit on the number of books that characters are allowed to use to players are allowed to use to generate their character. So you know, this is not beyond kind of what's reasonable. And again, in terms of selling it to your players, you know, not everybody has access to everything everywhere ever created for D&D, and just agreeing, you know, these are the, you know, going to use the player's handbook obviously, but then there's maybe a couple of other things that we'll look at, but beyond that, that's it. You know, is part of that kind of setting the ground rules, and it's quite normal. And I think, you know, it's entirely legitimate to say we're not going to be using particularly any, you know, third-party material, or we're not going to be using any unearthed arcana stuff that has yet to make it into an official hardback book. Let's put all that stuff to one side and just agree these are the you know, the couple of sources that we are allowed to use in terms of the player races and character subclasses that are on the table. And I don't think that's a unreasonable restriction. And then the other thing that you might want to think about is the variant human. Now, the variant human is very clearly labelled in the player's handbook as an option. So it's well within the GM's rights to say, well, we'll just use the standard human who gets a kind of +1 bonus across the board. Won't be using the variant human. Thank you very much. And that will take away feats as something that are available to characters for the first 4 levels of, well, the first 3 levels of play, until they get to the point where they have an ability score improvement, and then they can spend they can spend that option on acquiring a feat instead. So that's at, I think, 4th level, if I remember correctly. So it just kind of takes those things out of consideration for the very early part of the game, while still allowing everybody to play all the races that they want. You may find the side effect of that is you end up with less human characters. So if that is a problem for you, you may want to just live with the fact that you know, you've got some humans in there who've got a feat, and you know, just be aware of that. The fact that you're using a standard array or point buy will tend to discourage your players from spending a lot of their ability score improvements on feats anyway, because they'll want to get their primary ability up to an 18, and so they will tend to want to spend their first ability improvement on increasing their primary ability at least. So you'll find that, you know, in the levels of play that you're playing, that kind of 1 through 10, there are not very many feats coming in anyway, so you might not feel it's necessary to kind of say, we won't be using the human variant, but that is an option for you. And that's basically it. I think on the player side, that's really all you need to do, which is just to kind of put a limit on the number of core books that are available, maybe think about the human variant and not allow rolled characters. And that's as far as I would go. And I would think that probably a good percentage of 5th edition games, just ordinary 5th edition games, already would kind of use some kind of combination of those things anyway. Maybe not the human variant bit so much, but certainly, you know, I've seen a lot of, and I've been a part of a lot of games where we've not been rolling to get our characters. So what can you do on the Dungeon Master side to make the game deadlier and to make the experience more challenging, if that's what you and your players want to do? So there's a lot you can do, actually, and as I said, some of it is quite subtle, and some of it is quite obvious, quite honestly. And I think, you know, the first thing to do from a GM perspective is just to be aware of how 5th edition is built and what the kind of assumptions behind the game are, because if you're coming at 5th edition from other editions of the game, as I did back in 2014, 2015, when I moved over from those earlier versions of the game to run my first kind of version of 5th edition, you know, there was the play test, and then the starter box came out, and, you know, I bought those straight away, played them straight away. Is you don't necessarily appreciate just how 5th edition is built to not need magic items, number one. It just doesn't, the characters are self-sufficient. They do not require magic items, and certainly, you know, coming from the 3rd edition of the game, where magic items were a necessary part of the build, and also I think that something was very similar in 4th edition as well, and it was assumed that the GM would be giving out so many items of a certain type, and none of that applies to 5th edition. So, you know, you can quite happily not give out any magic, and it will probably, other than maybe get players saying, well, where's the magic, it won't make a massive difference. And so it's really important, particularly, not to give out magical weapons or magical armor. Don't give things that give boosts to armor class, and do not give things that give boosts to players' ability to hit, because they will get those things as part of their leveling up process. Use magic instead as a way of kind of building the characters, giving them flavor, giving them useful extra abilities in combat, and most particularly outside of it. There's plenty of great items in the Dungeon Master's Guide that don't focus around that kind of mechanistic improvement to the raw statistics of the game, that are very suitable. And just follow the advice about how few items are required as you level up. It really is a lot less than in other editions of the game, so don't overdo it. The other thing I would say is just be aware of the kind of assumptions that the game has about the numbers of encounters that the players are expected to face before they have a long rest. And this is the bit of the game that I've struggled with the most, in all honesty, because that number is quite high compared with some earlier editions of the game, and it is 6 to 8 encounters a day. And so in order to get anywhere near that number of encounters, you're going to have to make sure that you track time carefully. Time is going to run very much more at a pace where it's not quite one-to-one with game time, but it certainly, days are going to be a lot longer, and you are going to have to throw random encounters at your players, and it's really important that you try to get, you know, at least 5 or 6 encounters in there, and most of those, nearly all of those, need to be some kind of combat encounter. They all don't need to be equally hard, but you know, you should be, if you want to challenge your players, that is the way to do it, and that is the way to encourage that kind of resource management element of the game, so they're not kind of, they know they've got one encounter today and they're just going to nova that encounter and throw everything at that encounter. If they know that they're facing, and they get used to facing more encounters per day, they will start to manage their resources. They're less likely to nova on you. They're going to try and use their cantrips. They're going to try and use their other resources to try to deal with situations, and the game is going to be better as a result of that. So you know, carefully count time, carefully keep an eye on the number of encounters, and as part of that, you know, there's other things you can count. You know, if you're going into a dungeon, to give that kind of early edition feel, you know, you should be monitoring the player's use of light and food, and you should be getting them to regularly knock those things off on their list of resources that they have available to the party, their inventories, and you should be challenging them in short rests and long rests, with the potential that their camp is not in a safe place, and therefore they are not going to get the full night's sleep, or their sleep may be disturbed, because, you know, realistically, in the kind of fantasy world that 5th edition supposes, safety and a full long night's rest uninterrupted might not be something that's available routinely outside of certain safe havens. So it should always be a challenge to find somewhere in the wild, or in a dungeon, or in an adventuring environment where they'll get that rest. And there are rules in the DMG that talk about long rest, and talk about how it can be interrupted to a degree without them losing the advantages of it. And even giving the players the worry that they'll lose a long rest is something that I would encourage. And, you know, torches and oil for lanterns burns down a lot quite quicker than players think. Dim light means that they're making perception checks with disadvantage. Make sure you're using all those rules that are there in the game to challenge players and make the environment more threatening and deadly, and that will increase the kind of gritty feel for your game, if that is what you're after, without you having to make massive adjustments to the rules and changing, you know, huge sections of how the game actually plays. So we talked about magic, we've talked about the kind of adventuring day. What else can you do? Well, you know, I would be probably quite stingy, if that's a word, with how often I give out inspiration. I would not routinely start characters off with inspiration. I would really make them earn it for exceptional actions within the game, and, you know, it may be that they go whole sessions without getting inspiration, because actually, you know, mechanically they don't need it. It should be a real reward and a highlight, rather than a routine thing that you give out. And again, that is something that you can do, and players will as long as you haven't, eliminated inspiration entirely from the game, players will take that within the run of the usual range of 5th edition experiences that they're used to coming across without complaining too much, in my experience. And then the last thing I would do is, just in terms of monsters, forget the idea of balance. You're not there to present a world, in my opinion, that is balanced, because you're trying to give a kind of a gritty, more challenging environment, and therefore you don't need to come up with kind of level appropriate encounters for them. That's not to say that they should always be hit by things that are massively beyond their ability to cope with. It just means that occasionally they may walk into something which is beyond their power level, and they need to learn, as we all learn in the earlier editions of the game, that there are times when you just need to run away, or defeat or work around that encounter in a different way, without fighting. And it's amazing how you do that a couple of 3 times, and how it changes play at your table, and makes players more cautious and more calculating. And I think, given that our objective here, which is to make the game more like the earlier editions, then that's mission achieved. So don't worry too much about balance, and certainly look carefully at your monsters, in the variations of the monsters that are available in the monster manual, and also the sort of third-party monsters that have been made available. Change things up a little. Certainly do not routinely have solo monsters that aren't backed up by minions or henchmen, because of the way the action economy works in 5th edition. It's very, very easy for players to focus fire on one solo monster and destroy it before it even gets an attack off. And I'll also think about kind of monster intelligent behavior and what that means, and if necessary, have monsters think about how they may use cover, how they may try and ambush and surprise the players, also how they may use the terrain to their advantage. If they're spellcasters, what kind of spells they are going to use in the very early rounds of combat, because that's maybe all they get before they're eliminated. How they're going to deploy the various forces. All these kind of intelligent play of monsters will help you challenge your players, and give them a better, more gritty experience, if that is what you and they have kind of signed up for. So, as I say, I think there's a lot you can do, which is really just about making use of the tools that are available to you as a dungeon master, understanding the way the game is built, the maths of the game is built, staying within those kind of early levels of play, and not having, therefore, to create a game which is not recognizable to a lot of players as 5th edition, because that takes away the attractiveness of it, of your table, to a large number of people who want to play recognizably 5th edition style characters with the normal subclasses, etc., and access to feats and things like that. And I think you'll find, if you follow those basic principles, you'll find that actually 5th edition can be more like old school games of Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy games, which are challenging and which are very fulfilling for both for you as a GM and for your players, and which people will look back on fondly and have lots of positive memories of, without you always feeling, oh gosh, how am I going to challenge them this time, because they're just going to steamroller through anything that I put in front of them. So I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it the sort of thing that is going to be helpful to think about for your own table, if you're not already doing some of this stuff. and I look forward to your comments and suggestions for other things you think that on the sort of subtler side of the GM techniques may help get closer to a deadlier, more challenging 5th edition game without losing the basic set of principles that lie behind this vastly popular rule set. So goodbye for now. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.